I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism.
Most political campaigns, they are ramped up over the space of less than a year, sometimes just a few months. And after the election, the campaign offices close up shop. And if the candidate is lost, literally nothing is left behind. So tens of millions of dollars can go into, say, a Senate race, and the Democrat can lose. And there's no legacy of all that investment and spending by donors.
Hi, friends. Welcome back from watching or attending the Democratic National Convention. I was absolutely blown away by the convention. Yes, the way it came off without a hitch, but mostly because of the consistent freedom messaging, the focus on the voters, and the patriotism on display. We've talked about patriotism here before, and as Adam Kinzinger noted, the Democrats have always been patriotic in that fight to make what you believe happen sort of way, but not in the chanting USA way. We've known for a while that we need to reclaim the flag, the idea of patriotism, the concept of freedom, because neither the flag, nor the country, nor freedom are Republican owned. I was so excited to watch the beautiful emotion on display, and Kamala Harris knocked her speech out of the park using the freedom framing we've been talking about for years. And now that all the pageantry is over, it's time to do something. I know all of you are already doing a lot, but now it's time to break out of our circles and do something new. Share this podcast with someone not already familiar with it. Join a giving circle or a postcarding team or a text team. And for sure, register voters and keep reminding them to check their registrations. And don't sleep on the states. This means that Republican control is already happening in red states, and some other blue states have the potential to flip the United States House and keep the Senate, which is also crucial to Democratic power building. Amanda Littman, head of Run for Something, who we talked to earlier this year, has been pointing out outstanding members of the Democratic bench who are Run for Something alumni, such as Mallory McMorrow, Jasmine Crockett, and a whole bunch more. We know, as a Freedom Over Fascism community, how important it is to be running candidates and contesting races from the local to the state to the federal level. And while there are several organizations helping this, and we've talked to them all, and will continue to, there's another side to that story, and that's the donor story. This week, I talked to David Callahan, founder of Inside Philanthropy and Blue Tent. With Blue Tent and its project People's House, David helps donors decide where to invest for the most traction. And that usually doesn't mean donating to already well-funded individual candidates. He believes in power building, strengthening organizations on the ground in swing and battleground states to be able to keep working after a cycle is done, keep building engagement, and keep fielding candidates. We also talk about flipping the House. The road to flipping the House can actually be in blue states like California and New York, where just a couple of seats will change the balance of power nationally. This is a great conversation about investing in politics in a sustainable way. And I want to say a word about creating a better politics that calls out the best in us rather than the worst. One of the ways we can do that is by embracing the joy that Kamala and Tim have infused into the national campaign. There are legacy media stories that denigrate joy as not a political strategy, but it matters. Joy means more volunteers, more donations, more attendance at events, more voter registration. It takes politics from the realm of the death match into the realm of the joyful warriors. And who wouldn't be rather part of something fun, welcoming, and happy? So let's get out there, keep taking joy in what we're doing, ignore the polls, and work our asses off for both Kamala and our down ballot races. And now for my conversation with David Callahan, which you'll want to stick around for if you've ever donated to or thought about donating to a political organization, whether it's the price of your Starbucks or if you've got the big bucks. David Callahan, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
It's great to be here.
You are the founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy and Blue Tent, which identify best giving opportunities. Can you tell us more about Blue Tent and then the project People's House within that?
I founded Blue Tent in 2021, and the goal of the site is to help progressive and democratic donors give more effectively so that their dollars can have more impact. And I created this site after the 2020 election when so many people felt that they wanted to do something. Record amounts of money was given by people on the left, but a lot of it didn't get to the right places. And I think a lot of donors felt frustrated that there's all this urgency, but it's very hard to identify what the best places to give are. Blue Tent aims to help people navigate this world of a lot of different choices that you have if you want to help elect Democrats and advance progressive change.
One of the things that we talk a lot about here is how important it is to build power in the states and also to run candidates at every level, local, state, and federal. We've also found that when people just give to candidates, that money is used for the candidate. And then after the election, it gets rolled up, the data gets rolled up, it's gone poof. How do you think about that? And how do you come up with where to donate? And then how do you communicate about that?
Yeah, what you just said about giving money to candidates and how not much maybe will be left over afterwards in terms of power building is exactly right. And people talk about this as the sandcastle effect, which is that most political campaigns, they are ramped up over the space of less than a year, sometimes just a few months. And after the election, the campaign offices close up shop. And if the candidate is lost, literally nothing is left behind. So tens of millions of dollars can go into, say, a Senate race, and the Democrat can lose. And there's no legacy of all that investment and spending by donors. On the other hand, if you give money to a statewide organization to build power, then win or lose, that organization is going to make progress toward building its roles of members, better understanding the terrain and issues and what's on people's minds, helping create an infrastructure to win future elections. So, a through line of our work at Blue Tent and what informs a lot of our recommendations is that it's better for donors to give money to organizations than it is to give to candidates, not just because of this power building effect of giving to organizations that are working year round to organize people, but also statewide organizations, they help candidates up and down the ballot, right? If you give to the Senate race in Arizona, for example, if you give right now just to the candidate, that will help the candidate, but it's not necessarily going to help win other important battles in Arizona, such as ensuring the presidential race there goes to Harris, or helping flip the state legislative chambers there, or helping win two critical House races in Arizona. So we recommend giving money to Lucha, which is the main statewide group in Arizona, which has a tremendous amount of experience in turning out voters.
So, how do you make decisions about which organization you feel is best in each state?
It's a process of conversation and research and due diligence. In many battleground states, strong progressive organizations that have a very good reputation. We reach out, we talk to the leaders, try to get a sense of what their plan is. Ideally, we see their strategic plan on paper, how many doors they plan to hit, what their mix is of their canvassing in person and their digital strategy. We look at their past record of electoral impact. We also piggyback quite a bit on other funding groups that have more capacity for due diligence. If an organization has gotten a lot of support from, say, the Ford Foundation, the Open Societies Foundation, or um, funders who really know how to have the capacity to do due diligence, that is an important signal that we pay attention to. In addition, the data driven analysis of groups like Focus for Democracy and Mind the Gap inform our thinking about a group. If there's a lot of metrics that show the effectiveness of a group, that can be really useful. All that said, not all organizations are able to do that kind of data gathering about their work, especially when you start getting down more to the local level or looking at less well resourced organizations in, say, the youth organizing space.
Do you only focus on battleground states, or are you also interested in power building in what I call MAGA captured states, where it's going to be a long process, but it has to start somewhere? Donors are often unwilling to keep donating in a place where candidates keep losing, which is a cycle because then people don't run and we leave a lot of seats uncontested and then it keeps going. What is your view on battleground states versus power building states?
I think it's important for all donors to have a mixed portfolio of giving that they do. On the one hand, you really want to put resources into winning those battleground states and competitive congressional districts that can decide who wins the next election. The near term outcomes really matter. On the other hand, I think that all donors should put aside some money to invest in places where power building is going to take time and that we're never going to win those places unless we make investments over time. And for example, we've talked a lot about the need to invest in North Carolina, which is this year really is a battleground state, but it's a place that donors have often overlooked and dismissed because they're so focused on closer states, Arizona or Wisconsin or Michigan. But there's a critical mass of donors who have stuck out and invested over years in groups in North Carolina. And we're now seeing the results of that. The progressive groups in North Carolina plan to knock on 4 million doors this election cycle, and that could really help flip the state. In terms of contesting elections in more deep red places, I think that's a great strategy. I love Run for Something, also like
Mhm.
Contest Every Race,
Right.
two organizations that are explicitly focused on making sure that there are Democratic candidates who run in all these different deep red places that Democrats have often dismissed. And one huge positive effect of that is it can create up ballot coattails of when you have somebody who's running for a very local office in some rural red district. It can help turn out their friends and get some improvements in the Democratic rural vote share. And the thing about rural America is Democrats don't have to win those places, they just have to lose by less. And so when you have down ballot candidates running in previously uncontested races, it can really help with that effect.
We on this podcast have talked to Amanda Littman of Run for Something. We've talked to Contest Every Race. We've talked to Every State Blue, and I am dedicated to this idea. Oh, and the Outrun Coalition. This is something I don't know if you know who they are, but they are a group that works to elect young and diverse candidates in deep red areas, and they've had a lot of success. And I don't think they're funded. I am absolutely convinced that we need to be contesting everything because, yes, this presidential election is the most important, right? If we lose this presidential election, we lose democracy. But what is in Project 2025 and what the Republicans want to accomplish is already happening in a lot of states. So getting power back in the states, I think, is something that's beginning to not be overlooked, but has been for a long time.
And to just add to that, those important points, there are places that most people don't think of as ever going to be competitive, like Mississippi. And in fact, if you look at the demographic trends in those places, they are more promising than you might think. Just to stick with that Mississippi example, a third of the electorate in Mississippi is African American, right?
Right.
And you have more generational change among the white population, more Latino immigrants coming in. So it's not unthinkable that Mississippi could be competitive in the not so distant future. But you need Democrats who are on the ground, progressive organizers who are working with a long term vision to make that happen. And you need donors who are standing behind them and are willing to patiently make those investments, just like they might make any other kind of long term investment, right? Alaska is another good example, very large native population there that's really changed the electoral math and has the potential to do so much more going forward. And we've seen some dividends from that just recently with that Democratic member of Congress emerging from Alaska, which who would have thought that would have been possible, right?
Right.
Beating Sarah Palin, right?
Do you have trouble finding funders who are interested in investing long term? Or are a lot of people saying, tell us where to put our money because this is a long term effort and we're in it for long term?
We have not been putting most of our effort into raising money for that long term side of the fence. I'll regularly make that case to donors. And as I said, big fan of Run for Something, contest every race. And I think that donors need to hear the rap about having a balanced portfolio and putting some money toward those longer term investments. Beyond the battleground states, though, in this election cycle, we have a project focused specifically on power building in congressional districts to help flip the House, but also hold these competitive seats going forward. And this has been really interesting. It's called People's House. You mentioned at the
Right.
beginning of our conversation. And this has been a really interesting project because it turns out that if you want to help win a congressional race, it's very hard to find progressive organizations working in competitive districts that are a clear kind of place to put money to help win a congressional race. Progressive infrastructure has come a long way since 2016. There's been a huge number of new organizations created, a lot of great dynamic power building efforts. We now have really fantastic capacity to help drive voter turnout in statewide races. But a lot of progressive infrastructure is in urban areas. And you win statewide races because you have strong organizing and sit in purple states and that's really important. But guess where most of these congressional districts are that we need to flip? They're in suburban areas, they're in rural areas, ex-urban areas. These are not hotbeds of progressive infrastructure, right? So,
Right.
and so we've spent the last year and a half trying to identify organizations that are doing this work that we can recommend to donors. And we now have 16 different partner organizations that we're recommending in 18 different congressional districts that people can check out on our People's House website, peopleshouse.us. And it's been super fascinating. And I think it's been an overlooked area of progressive infrastructure building. And for many donors, if they want to flip the house, it's give to the DCCC or give to a candidate, and there's not a lot of other options. So we're hoping to create a richer and more promising menu in that regard.
In terms of flipping the house, there's a lot of room for improvement in typically blue states like California and New York, where you're focused in the main urban areas for statewide races, but there's still enough congressional seats that if you don't pay attention, they can actually flip the house. So our main audience is activists. Most times, activists will choose where they're going to be active and then they ask for funding. Is it possible or does it happen that identify an area where there aren't yet organizers and say, create some sort of funding mechanisms where people can say, oh, I want to organize. Where am I most needed? And then go there and have some funding to get going. Or is that just the wrong way around and it doesn't happen that way?
I think for deeper pocketed funders with more resources, it's easier to incubate things and get the ball rolling. But we're a pass through. We make recommendations to donors who, so it's very hard for us to recommend anything but existing efforts. If there's nothing happening in a given congressional district, it's hard for us to make something happen from scratch, and we haven't tried to do that. And sadly, in some competitive and winnable congressional districts, there's almost no organizing that we could identify, like in Iowa's third congressional district. And it really goes to show that there are gaps in progressive infrastructure for winning control of Congress. This is a very important objective, you may recall, right? Like winning the House is incredibly important. And yet it seems oddly under resourced in terms of where all the money has been flowing in the past 8 years.
It seems to me that the progressive ecosystem has been oddly financed and organized for a long time, and I think we're finally getting what Republicans got a long time ago, is that you actually have to pay attention to these places where you could win, but it's not the easiest place to organize and win. Can you give our activist audience more ideas of specific organizations in battleground states or in places that could flip the house where they could think about investing?
There are two really exciting coalitions that have been formed in the last year to help flip House seats in California and also New York. One is called Battleground California, and one is called Battleground New York. And what's super cool about these organizations is that they represent an unprecedented effort to mobilize voters in congressional races to flip House seats held by Republicans and also hold Democratic seats. And in blue states like California and New York, a big problem is that voters feel like their vote doesn't really count for much, right? Because they're not in presidential battleground states. So there's often less voter turnout than there is in Wisconsin or Michigan.
Mhm.
Uh, and this is a real problem for congressional races because in many of these places, Democrats outnumber Republicans, but if they don't turn out, that doesn't help you very much. So
Right.
in 2022, Democrats lost control of the House of Representatives by less than 7,000 votes across just 5 congressional districts. And the places where we got clobbered the most were in California and New York, where we lost multiple seats, particularly in New York. It was a really kind of searing experience. And it kind of underscored to many activists and organizers in those states that there had been an underinvestment in progressive infrastructure, and we'd taken these blue states for granted, right? And in both states, progressive leaders set out to create new ways to do these races. So Battleground California is really interesting. It's organized through the California Donor Table and some other
Mhm.
organizations there. And one of the core groups that is part of this coalition is Communities for New California, which I think is a very exciting grassroots membership based organization that's working across multiple districts in California. And one thing that makes it so interesting is because it's very zeroed in on the Latino vote and particularly the nonpartisan, non party preference, younger Latinos who are making up an increasingly important part of the electorate and who often are registering as independents and are not deeply committed to either political party. And so Communities for New California, I think, is on the vanguard of trying to figure out like who are these? What do these voters want? How can we connect with them? What sort of messages resonate? So that's an organization I think that is quite interesting for activists to look at. We're also recommending a couple different youth organizing groups where there's a lot of energy right now. A number of these groups have been around for a while. Some are newer, kind of post 2016. There's a kind of umbrella organization called the Alliance for Youth Action that coordinates a lot of these groups. And a couple of the members of that alliance that we're supporting are Forward Montana,
Mm.
which is the top youth organizing group in Montana, and New Era, Colorado, and Next Up, which is in Oregon. So those are 3 youth organizing groups. And I could talk about any of the 3 and say all sorts of nice things because they're inspiring, because they're out trying to engage people who, um, while they vote heavily Democratic, young people, they also vote at rates much lower, even with the increases of turnout in the last few election cycles. They're still 20 points behind older people. And so this is a really important thread of work for activists and donors to be paying attention to right now.
It is really exciting because If you've got a young voter registering independent, the voter files don't catch them, the Democratic voter files. And my guess is they are under the radar, even in places that are starting to begin to organize. Do you point organizations toward tools that they could be using to invest in or buy? I talked to Jeremy Smith of Civitech. Do you think about new kinds of tools, specifically those who reach either unregistered or uninterested or voters who are not consistent voters?
This is an area that's beyond our capacity that right now, we're just raising money for organizations and sometimes we make connections here and there to resources. But many of these organizations are pretty well plugged in and don't need our help in accessing resources. I think for more local grassroots activists, they can really benefit from connecting to good clearinghouses of resources and tools. But we're backing and recommending organizations that are at a kind of higher level of capacity. So they already have some pretty sophisticated methodologies and access to the data tools and voter file tools that they need to do their work.
I guess that's where people like me come in because I talk to people like you and people who have tools. The whole point is to inspire people hearing about other activists in other states and hearing about tools they could use and hearing about funding networks that they could tap into and all of the above. And I'm totally aware. I'm in Massachusetts now, so it's the same, but we have fewer electoral college votes. To We've been taught to think our vote doesn't matter in California because usually presidential races are done before California's polls even close. And it doesn't occur to us that, and us, I haven't lived there in 25 years. It doesn't occur to them that their vote is so important because the state legislature is already Democratic. Button flipping the House is really important. Are people receptive to thinking about California in a different way? Or are they, particularly the people who live in Los Angeles, San Francisco, the entire Bay Area, Silicon Valley, are they receptive or are they checked out?
I think that there's a lot of interest among Californians in flipping house seats. You live in Massachusetts. I live in California. I've lived here for 10 years. I'm still trying to figure the place out as a longtime East Coast native. I live in Santa Monica. And I think a lot of people who are progressive in California feel this sense of outrage that we could be doing so poorly in some of these pivotal congressional races that and determine the control of the House of Representatives. And it's often said that the road to a Democratic House runs through California. And I think that's very true. There's 5 different districts here that are flipperable this cycle, districts that Biden won in 2020, where Democrats should have the votes to win in 2024. But it takes turning out voters. I did a analysis of a voter turnout in 2022 and that the number of people who were sitting on the sidelines and did not vote in that election in those 5 districts. It was over 1 million voters who did not vote in 5 districts in 2022. And that is also true in New York as well. And so I think people get it that we need greater, stronger voter turnout and also persuasion efforts to win these congressional districts. But a traditional political campaign is not going to do that work because these Democratic candidates and the campaigns they run and the BCCC and the House Majority PAC and this infrastructure for winning congressional races, it's good at doing certain things, right? It's good at running TV ads and doing polls and doing digital ads and radio ads. These campaigns are not good at being trusted messengers that can connect with people and overcome their cynicism about politics and their skepticism that their vote matters. This is one of the biggest barriers that we face is convincing people to vote at all, much less convincing them who to vote for, right?
Right.
And a political campaign is not going to do that work by broadcasting a 30-second ad at them, right? It takes a community based organization that builds trust with people and can get a hearing from them.
And it also takes good candidates. It's not always true that any candidate will do, but sometimes it'll take a good candidate to really connect with folks. But I agree, like, especially in California, I never experienced anybody canvass in my entire life. So I grew up in Santa Clarita, went to college in Claremont, lived in San Francisco afterwards, never experienced somebody coming to my door and knocking on it. And I wonder whether because it's never been a state where you had to do a whole lot to get what you thought your goals were, that may be a culture that needs to grow and rise and be cultivated in California and in rural areas of New York as well.
That's why these new coalitions focused on retaking the House. I mentioned and talked about Battleground New York, which is a effort by many of the top progressive organizations in New York State to come together and do what is likely to be the largest voter outreach effort in New York history in this election cycle, focused on 6 different congressional districts. And that effort really grew out of the realization, as you were just saying, that there's not a lot of contact of voters in these places and they're taken for granted, and that there hasn't been a development of progressive infrastructure that optimally you would see in a place which literally the road to that Democratic House also runs through New York, which has
Mhm.
many races that are up for grabs this year. And in a way, it's an interesting parallel to the point we were talking about earlier of how um, Democrats have dismissed and not even competed in red parts of the country, deep red states and counties. And just as it's important to make the investments there, I think it's important to stop taking these blue states for granted and do some power building in those places. And this election cycle is really done, I think, a lot to jumpstart that work after the searing losses of 2022.
And these, at least in California, New York, just have so many people that I don't think people who live in smaller states really get the scope of the population and how much you could do. If you could give a sort of final pitch to our listeners about what the most important things for them to think about, donate to, consider working at, can you just wrap up by speaking directly to them about how they can be most effective?
I think that a good thing to always keep in mind is that any amount of money as a political donor makes a difference. The emerging importance of small donors, that people who are giving $50 or $25 have really changed the trajectory of American politics. Bernie Sanders raised $450 million in his 2 runs for president. And I think really changed the trajectory of American politics by pulling the Democratic Party significantly to the left. And although he didn't win, he's probably the most impactful non winning presidential candidate in history. And all that was made possible by small donors. So no matter how much money you have, just keep that in mind. Second, there's a lot of opportunities out there for phone banking and kind of distant efforts. If you live in a blue state, different organizations that will connect you up, Swing Left being one of them. And also organizations that are focused on down ballot races like Sister District, which is good to know about, or there's giving circles. There's a lot of different ways for people in blue states to get involved. And I think that should make people hopeful and not feel like they just need to sit in Brooklyn wringing their hands, right? And the second thing I would say, just in terms of hierarchy of priorities in different states and races, is that Arizona, in my mind, is the mother of all battleground states in this election. because you have so much at stake in that one state. You have a Senate race that needs to be won to decide control of the Senate. You have two competitive House races with vulnerable incumbents who can be taken out. And of course, you have the electoral votes of Arizona, which remember, Biden only won Arizona by 11,000 votes or something like that in 2020. And in addition, Democrats in Arizona have the opportunity to get a governing trifecta there by picking up just a few legislative seats at the Senate and Assembly district levels. There is no better place to put your effort and energy if you're thinking specifically geographically where to donate or where to do some phone banking than Arizona. And the organization we recommend is Lucha, which has a reputation as the most effective grassroots organization in Arizona. And it's an electoral powerhouse that everybody should know about.
That is a lot of great information for people who are already involved, people who want to get more involved, people who don't quite know how to help, but know that they need to, and also understand how much local, state, down ballot races are as much as a presidential. Because we're all talking about Kamala and Walz right now, and that's really important, and raising money for them is really important, but also we need the House and the Senate and state legislatures as well. Any last thoughts you have before I let you go?
Just to underscore the importance of winning the House as a kind of insurance policy. If all else goes wrong, having control of the House will be an all important firewall against MAGA extremism. And in many ways, it's also the most doable goal here because Republicans only control the House by a few seats.
Right.
Democrats need to make a very little headway in terms of flipping seats and holding seats to win control of the House. And so either in the worst case scenario, it's a firewall against Trumpism, or in the best case scenario, we get a governing trifecta and we take back the House and then we hold the Senate, which is certainly possible. And we win the presidency, in which case, we're back in business with a major Democratic legislative opportunity in front of us. And that would be extremely exciting.
Thank you so much, David Callahan, for being with us and talking about how donors can really diversify their portfolio in ways that help lots of different people in lots of different places. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's great to be on your show.
Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Please leave a rating or review wherever you listen. And if you can, please subscribe at www.freedomoverfascism.us.